On the floor beside a rosewood bed, in a room that still smells of French perfume and cold champagne, lies a gown. It came from Paris. It cost $800. The woman who wore it the night before is still in the bed. She is not sleeping. One of the girls found her at dawn, barely breathing, and ran for the doctor. He arrives 20 minutes later. There's nothing to be done. She is 37 years old. Her name, on paper, is Eliza Martin. The town knows her as Pearl de Vere. It is June 5th, 1897. Cripple Creek, Colorado. The women the West called soiled doves, painted ladies, or simply girls of the line did not come from nowhere. Most arrived in frontier towns the same way Pearl de Vere did, young, alone, and without options, the law recognized as legitimate. Pearl was born Eliza Martin in Evansville, Indiana, in October 1859. She arrived in Denver as a young woman with no trade and no family waiting. The West offered women in her position 2 documented paths to income. She chose the one that paid more. The town she settled into smelled of sawdust, horse manure, and cheap cologne. The crib, a one-room wooden structure barely 8 feet wide, lined along back alleys called the Row, rented for twice what a hotel room cost. The women paid the rent from their earnings. They also paid for their own clothes, their own medicine, and any fine a marshal decided to collect on a given morning. The law did not protect them. It invoiced them. The work existed in a legal gray space that shifted depending on the town, the election year, and the sheriff's finances. Some towns tolerated it, some taxed it. A handful licensed it outright. None guaranteed the women inside it any safety, any recourse, or any path out that did not require starting over with nothing. The average age of a brothel woman in the 1880s American West was 23 years old. Most were under 30. In one documented census study of St. Paul brothels from the same era, 55 out of 56 women were single. They were not figures living at the margins. They were the demographic center of a frontier economy that depended on them and refused to acknowledge them. 23 years old, younger than most college graduates are today. Pearl de Vere was one of those women. She would not stay at the bottom of the economy she had entered. Pearl de Vere charged $250 a night by the time she owned the old homestead. She was 37 years old when she died. I keep thinking about Pearl when she arrived in Denver, with no plan and no option the law recognized. What would you have done? Tell me down below. In Virginia City, Nevada, 2 decades before Pearl built her reputation in Cripple Creek, a woman named Julia Bulette was becoming the most talked-about woman on the Comstock Lode. The legend that grew around her described a wealthy courtesan, beloved by the fire brigade, respected by the mining community, living in comfort and independence. Julia Bulette worked out of a small rented cottage near the corner of D and Union Streets. She competed with brothels, streetwalkers, and dance hall girls for whatever income she could find. At the time of her death, she was ill and in debt. On the morning of January 20th, 1867, a maid found her partially naked in her bedroom. She had been strangled and bludgeoned to death. She was 34 years old. A French drifter named John Millane was convicted and executed 14 months later. His execution witnessed by a young reporter named Mark Twain. The town mourned Julia Bulette in the newspapers. It did not mention the debt. The gap between the Bulette of legend and the Bulette of the arrest records and account books is not incidental. It is the same gap that appears whenever a woman from a discarded profession becomes famous only after she dies. The legend requires the person to disappear first, then replaces her with the version the story needs. The wealth, the independence, the social standing. All of it arrived after the murder. Before it, there was a rented room and money she did not have. Not every woman left a legend. Most left nothing at all. One account from a woman working the Badlands district, one of the rare direct testimonies to survive the era, describes being beaten by a customer whose advances she refused. Her response, recorded and passed down, was precise. "I don't mind the black eye, but he called me a whore." She had been called worse. The black eye she could bear. The word was the part that left a different kind of mark. 3 years before Pearl died, a 23-year-old woman named Nellie Stanley was found unconscious at Belle Haskell's brothel at 400 Main Street in Deadwood, Dakota Territory. She had overdosed on a painkiller called anticamnia, sold without prescription at any general store, marketed as safe. The people who knew Nellie Stanley did not believe it was an accident. She was the median age. She was 23. She died in the middle of the distribution and left one record, a coroner's entry and a line in a local newspaper that did not print her full name. Anticamnia stayed on American shelves for 15 more years before its dangers were formally acknowledged. That timeline would repeat itself almost exactly a century later, with a different class of painkillers sold under different names with the same argument: harmless, legal, and effective for the pain of staying alive. Pearl knew about women like Nellie Stanley. Everyone in the red light district did. The question was never whether the profession would cost you something. The question was what it would cost, and when. By 1896, Pearl de Vere had built something that looked, from the outside, like success. The old homestead was a 2-story brick building on Myers Avenue in Cripple Creek. Electric lamps, a telephone with intercom, 2 bathtubs with running water, individual bedrooms for every woman who worked there, and a viewing room where clients made their selections. She charged $250 a night. In today's terms, that is roughly $9,000. She was also taking morphine to sleep. The red light district at night smells of coal oil, cigarette smoke, and wood fires fighting the cold. The music runs constant: piano, fiddle, the thud of boots on bare wooden floors. The cold comes through the walls anyway. Women wrap shawls over their working clothes and stay in motion. Beneath that surface runs a second economy, quieter and more constant than the trade itself: the management of pain. Laudanum in the tea, morphine in the evening. Opium in a pipe behind a closed door. Doctors prescribed it. General stores stocked it. Employers pushed it. A sedated woman was easier to manage, easier to keep in place. Addiction arrived as medicine and became a different thing by degrees. Then it was simply part of the cost of staying in business. In Deadwood, Dakota Territory, the only physician in the early boomtown years was a man named Dr. Frank S. Howe. He made rounds across the camp: infected wounds from the mines, broken bones from fights, fevers spreading through rooming houses. When he packed his bag for the red light district, he always included one instrument he needed nowhere else in Deadwood: a stomach pump. Suicide attempts among brothel women were so frequent, so expected, that the town's only doctor prepared for them as a matter of routine. He did not carry the pump because he thought he might need it. He carried it because he always did. A hospital today would call this a high-risk population protocol, a standard clinical response to a documented, predictable pattern. In 1880s Deadwood, it was one doctor, one instrument, and a route through the dark that he knew by heart. By the mid-1880s, Deadwood alone had more than 100 brothels. Dr. Howe's stomach pump was not exceptional preparation. It was documentation. It recorded, in the only form the era left us, what he found on those calls, how often and how expected the pattern had become. None of it appeared in the newspapers. None of it made it into the civic records that described the town's growth and prosperity. It was one man and a route through the dark. Pearl de Vere is one of the few women from that world who left a record someone thought to preserve. Most did not. There are dozens of names in Deadwood alone, in coroner's reports, in faded arrest ledgers, in cemetery plots that have since gone unmarked. I am going to keep telling these stories. If this one stayed with you, leave a like. It helps this reach someone else who should hear it. Subscribe. The next woman deserves to be remembered too. Pearl de Vere was buried at Mount Pisgah Cemetery in Cripple Creek, the only woman from the sex trade documented to have been granted burial inside those grounds. Her brothel, the Old Homestead, continued operating under new ownership until 1916, 19 years after her death. It became a boarding house, then a private residence. In June 1958, it was opened as a museum. Deadwood's red light district stayed operational until 1980, when federal and state authorities closed the last 4 brothels. Roughly a century after Dr. Frank S. Howe began his rounds with a stomach pump, Jenny Phillips, who died in 1879 from an infection following a cat bite, and Nellie Stanley and hundreds of others like them left no museums. Most survive in the historical record only as names in arrest ledgers, census lists, and coroner's reports no one consulted for 100 years. They lived. They paid the costs the system set. They disappeared. 100 years from now, someone will tell your story. They will look at the systems of this time, the ones that felt fixed, the ones people adapted to because there was no visible way out. And they will wonder how anyone lived inside them without breaking. They will describe those choices the way we describe pearls, from a distance, with the clarity that only comes from not having been there. What separates us from the women of Cripple Creek and Deadwood is not intelligence. It is not character. It is that the system they were inside had no exit that did not cost everything. Health, years, sometimes a life before 40. They paid that cost. Most of them paid it quietly, without a stone to mark the spot, without a story told afterward. Pearl left a gown on the floor. Most left nothing. That is not a coincidence. It is the arithmetic of a closed system. And one day, someone will look at the systems we consider ordinary, the ones we navigate by habit, the ones we have simply accepted, and ask the same question about us. The gown is still on the floor in Cripple Creek, Colorado. It came from Paris. It cost $800. In the early morning light of June 5, 1897, it still holds the faint smell of French perfume. No one has moved it. The woman who wore it the night before is gone. What remains is silk, and a cold room, and a floor that will be swept clean.